The Millennium, a prophetic forecast by Johanna Brandt. Chapter 12, The Maid of Orleans. I'm no historian, and this book does not claim to be a history. Dates and details, facts and figures, seem to have a paralysing effect on the intuitive faculties with which I have been endowed. But in the history of Joan of Arc, I find myself on familiar ground. No brain-splitting mysteries here. No conflicting details. No distressing want of harmony between historians on the subject of the Maid. No lack of historical evidence in the story of her achievements. The Maid was simply an instrument in the hands of God, the willing tool, the marvellously receptive vessel of divine inspiration. She stands alone among women. She gives us a unique example of the contemplative life, combined with a force and energy which swept every obstacle out of her path, as husks are carried away before a storm. Although her life forms no part of the history of the Christian Church, it finds a rightful place in this small work on the influence of signs and wonders, voices and visions in the destinies of nations. The Maid was a born mystic. She proved this every time she stole away from her playfellows, or from her duties in the field, or at her spinning wheel, to the small church near her father's home, where she lost herself in prayer. One day in summer, after her weekly fast, when this peasant girl of Burgundy was barely 13 years old, she was sitting in her father's garden near the church, lost in reverie, when a dazzling light shone around her, brighter than the noonday glare. Kind and beautiful faces looked down on her. From out of this light, heavenly voices whispered the simplest injunctions into her ear. She must be a good child, she must be an obedient daughter, and she must take the vow of chastity and dedicate her life to God, for she would be called upon to go forth in His name to serve her beloved France. She obeyed. She took the vow of chastity, but the story of her vision she kept to herself. From that day, the heavenly faces became her most constant companions. In time, she came to know them quite well, and even to distinguish them by their voices. There was the Holy St. Catherine of Alexandria, plainly recognizable by the radiance of the halo surrounding her, and the sweet St. Margaret of Antioch, accompanied by a host of angel faces. At last, one day, a few years later, the mighty Archangel of War and Guardian of France, St. Michael of the Flaming Sword, appeared to her, and bade her to arise and go forth to the battle to deliver France from the yoke of foreign dominance. She wept and was sore afraid, saying that she could not ride and knew not how to wield the sword. But he urged her to be brave and obedient, for she would be guided and protected from on high. It was during the 100 Years' War between France and England in the 14th and 15th centuries. More than half of the French Empire had fallen into the hands of the British. The English king, Henry V, had been crowned as King of France, and the flower of the French aristocracy had been cut down in the long struggle against the inflowing tide. A dangerous feature to the French was the dissensions which had risen in their own ranks, a large section having ranged itself on the side of the victorious enemy against its own flesh and blood. France was divided into two great parties. On the one side, the triumphant British king with his train of followers, supported by the renegades of the country. On the other, the uncrowned king of France, the Dauphin Charles, ruined, forsaken, despairing, his last earthly support, the faithful Duke of Orleans. The last French stronghold, Orleans, was being besieged by the enemy. Its fall was only a matter of time, and would give the final blow to the retreating and wholly demoralized French armies. There was no deliverance, no hope, for the French in their despair, and the British in their triumph had forgotten the ancient prophecy. A maid from Burgundy shall trample the archers underfoot. Knowing that her parents would never be persuaded to consent to her leaving home on such an unheard of enterprise, she told her story to her uncle Laxart and implored him to help her. At first he laughed at her, but in time he was overruled by the power and fervour of her convictions and helped her to get through to Chinon, where the Dauphin was. The journey was through hostile country and extremely dangerous, but after 11 days the small party reached Chinon, and the king, who had been informed of her coming and was prepared to receive her. To test her prophetic powers, he concealed himself behind the oilier nobleman when she ruined the brilliant reception room. But Joan was not to be deceived. She singled him out of the crowd, and going up to him said, "God grant thee a happy life, noble Dauphin." He answered, "I am not the king. This is the king," and he pointed to one of the noblemen. "By my God," she replied, "thou art the king, and no other." The same extraordinary power of perception she displayed throughout her marvellous career as deliverer of France. Indeed, it was that harmony with the divine which enabled her throughout the strenuous campaign which followed to know exactly the best routes to take, to divine the right moment for action or repose, to follow up a victory or to withdraw with most advantage to the blench, to seize the enemy's weak points or to protect her own at the right moment. Many attempts had been made to prevent her from entering the castle, but the besieged city, Orleans, had heard of her promise of succor and sent a deputation to the king, imploring him to listen to her. She was as much at home in the palace of the king as in her own humble surroundings at Domremy. She moved with queenly unself-consciousness in a world of her own amidst the pomp and splendour of the world of men. In all things she was gracious and adaptable, but she was not to be deterred from the fulfilment of her task. When she began to find out that all this dallying at the court, the homage paid her, the visits of great ladies, the long discussions with grave theologians, were only meant to turn her attention from the mission which she regarded as heaven-inspired, she wept much in secret, praying ceaselessly. She had a secret sign to the king, which she was to use as a last resort if all her stormy eloquence and passionate pleadings failed, and it was this. The king was consumed with doubt about his own birth and his right to the throne, and he had laid this burden in solemn secret prayer before God, without revealing it to anyone on earth. He was therefore powerfully moved and impressed when one day she took him aside and said, with unspeakable meaning, "I say to thee from my king, thou art the true heir of France and son of the king." This decided the matter as far as the Dauphin was concerned. He gave her a household with squires and grooms, raised an army of 3,000 men, and had her provided with a white charger and an armour of steel that glittered in the sun like white silver, while her white banner embroidered with the lilies of France, floated around her like a bright cloud. From the first, she rode with ease and power. But she would accept no sword from the king. Her sword, she said, lay buried in the Catherine Church in the Verbois, and her guardian angels had commanded her to use that and no other in battle. A sword was found, indeed, in the spot indicated, and the multitudes began to regard her with awe as some celestial being sent to deliver them. At that moment, nothing more was required to ensure her success. Beautiful she was, and tall and straight and strong. With the removal of distressing material impediments, the maid's entire person underwent a change. The gentle eye, in which the impenetrable mystery brooded so long, flashed and kindled as she took command of her men. Her deep and penetrating voice rang out as if in challenge to the whole world. She bore herself as conqueror. Before her hand had been lifted in battle once. The prophetic vision, which had made her success a certainty to her from the first, enabled her to extend the hand of mercy to her enemies. She warned them solemnly of their fate. She summoned them to surrender, and she wept with girlish abandonment when their blood was shed. On the 29th April 1429, the Maid entered the city of Orleans with her rescuing army, being received by the crowds with every demonstration of joy and relief. They thronged around the house in which she had taken up her abode, until at last she came forth in her white raiment and shining armor, and rode through the streets, crying out in her ringing voice, "My king has sent me to succor the good town of Orleans." All day the church bells boomed their deep tones over the blackened and wasted land, and the besiegers knew that the Maid was worshipping and giving thanks. The next day, an altogether marvelous event took place. The gates of Orleans were thrown open, and the Maid rode forth on her white charger, bearing her lily banner aloft, and followed by her army and a crowd of armed and unarmed citizens. The strange procession followed her along the river, through the fields, wended its way all round the city, right under the forts of the enemy, and back to the city gates in silent fearlessness, which overawed the English troops and left them powerless. Again a miracle took place, when the Maid rode forth to guard the exit of Dunois, the bastard of Orleans, and a few nobles, whose ransoms were worth much to the enemy, on their way to fetch a reinforcing army from Blois. Having escorted them beyond the range of the enemy's darts, the Maid returned to the city alone and unharmed. As the enthusiasm of her people grew, the enemy seemed to become more paralyzed, while their leaders were lashed into a fury of impotent rage by the insolence of this tavern wench. She sent heralds to them, summoning them to surrender before it was too late, but her heralds were taken prisoner. The last time she fastened her summons to surrender round an arrow and launched it in the enemy's ranks. "Read, these are tidings to you, men of England, who have no right in this kingdom of France. The King of Heaven orders by me that ye abandon your forts and go home to your own country. Otherwise I will cause you such a crash of ruin as shall be held in perpetual remembrance. This I write to you for the third and last time, and I will never write to you again. Jesus Maria, Jean Lepousel, I would have sent you my letters more honorably, but you detained my heralds. "You detain my herald, Guyenne. Send him back to me, and I will send back to you some of your people taken in Saint-Loup, for they are not all dead." That was the end of peaceful negotiations. The first attack on the Bastille des Augustins failed, because there had been attempts in the Maid's council to deceive her. Her plans were ever undermined by the leaders of her army, and no wonder when we remember that the Maid knew beforehand what the result of such and such a step would be, and therefore proposed methods which seemed absurdly impossible and criminally unwise. And yet, wherever there was the slightest deviation from the instructions issued by her throughout the campaign, disaster was the inevitable result. The Maid came upon the scene in time, rallied her flying troops, and returning, took the fort of the Augustins. The next day, at dawn, she was at the gates of Orleans, ready to storm the enemy's forts. But here she was checked by the governor of the city, who, by the orders of the captains, forbade her to leave the city on such a hopeless errand. By this time the Maid had the people and the soldiers on her side, and she simply forced her way through the city gates. Then began that deadly assault which raged all day, and all but failed for a moment, when the Maid was wounded through the neck. The chiefs, ever wavering, insisted on abandoning the attack, but the Maid drew the dart from her neck with her own hands, and commanded her men to resume the fight, while she dressed the wound with a compress of olive oil. Her guardians had warned her beforehand that she would be wounded in this assault, and solemnly instructed her not to allow her troops to cease from their endeavours on that account. Although she seemed to mind the pain as much as any other girl would, she spurred her men bravely on through the blood and tears, holding her own in the thick of danger, at that most critical moment when the last assault took place. "Enter! All is yours!" she cried to her troops, and in the desperate hand-to-hand combat which ensued, the enemy was vanquished, Orleans saved. That was the beginning of her victories. On the 11th of June, the town of Jargeau fell. On the 15th, the bridge of the Meuse was taken. On the 17th, the town of Beaugency. The Battle of Pataya was won on the 18th, and without a moment's loss of time, the Maid returned to Orleans to bear the king away in spite of all opposition, to Reims, to be crowned. The splendours and ceremonials of that consecration on Sunday 17th July were hallowed by the presence of a spotless Maid, who knelt in tears at the feet of the newly crowned king, saying fervently, "The pleasure of God is now fulfilled." The Maid implored to be allowed to return to her mother and the care of her sheep, but she had become the darling of the court, the idol of the people, and they would not suffer her to leave them. There were the fair fields of France still to be recovered from the invader, and Joan undertook to drive the remaining English from French soil. But her real enemies had ever been the corrupt and envious, the slothful, treacherous nobles and courtiers of the king. "I fear nothing but traitors," she had said repeatedly, with strange insistence, as if her prophetic instinct warned her that in the end she would be undone through treachery. To this day, it is not certain that she was deliberately and basely betrayed into the hands of the enemy, but it is a fact that the gates of Compiègne closed against her just as she readied them in her flight from the Burgundians in a sally, closed against her and left her prisoner in hands from which no mercy could be expected. We all know the end. The long, cruel, merciless, exhausting trial. The swift, merciful end at the stake. As the flames rose round the maid, she waved the man aside, Brother Martin, who was holding up a crucifix before her eyes, and gently warned him of the approaching danger. 700 or 800 armed soldiers kept the seething multitudes from rescuing her, but they could not prevent her voice from reaching them, as she declared to the very last that her voices had been of God, and that all she had been done by the commandment of God, and that her revelations had been from God alone, and that she was innocent of the charge of witchcraft. Jesus, the clear voice murmured, as the noble young head sank lower and lower till it touched her breast. Jesus was wafted to the multitude, saint and martyr, prophetess and patriot, nation maker, mystic and warrior. Was there ever in the history of the world a more profound mystery than the life and achievements of this simple peasant girl?